many points in it that were really excellent, and I've seen nothing like that from our AU leadership in Victoria. And at my school, a couple of us started a petition calling for school closures. Everyone wanted to sign it. I was told by the organiser that the AU officials were negotiating that, and then later on I found out that that was not the case. So, yeah.
Yes. And now I need to put in.
Okay, yeah, I think we should probably start soon. So Sue, if you can sort of get started. I've started the live stream, but the link isn't being distributed until people start speaking. So because it's going to be right YouTube. So yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining this meeting, our first online meeting from Melbourne Socialist Alliance. The title of the meeting is COVID-19, Capitalism Puts Profits Before Health. And we're really grateful to have the range of speakers we've got tonight. And there will be time for questions and discussions afterwards for people who are on the Zoom connection. But we will also be doing a Facebook live stream for this as well. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that as we're hosting the meeting from Melbourne, we're on stolen land, the land of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, land which was stolen and never ceded, and we recognise that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. For people who are wondering who I am, my name is Sue Bolton and I'm a member of Socialist Alliance and I'm also a Moreland local councillor. So the way we'll run the meeting tonight, we've got 3 speakers, although we may possibly have a last minute addition from Italy. We're not sure about that yet, but we've got 3 fantastic speakers. Our first speaker will be Elizabeth Latham, who is a union activist, an education union activist, who's also a contributing editor of the Irish Broad Left and has also been contributing articles to Green Left Weekly on the COVID-19 crisis and particularly workers' rights. We've got Mary Mutiny. Workers, teachers and support staff workers' rights over many years, but especially right now for the rights of education workers during this crisis. And we've got Dick Nichols, who is a Green Left Weekly European correspondent based in Barcelona, Spain, right in the heart of one of the world epicenters. And the fact that we've got a speaker from Spain, as well as speakers from local speakers, will be an opportunity to contrast the responses to the COVID-19 crisis, both from our respective ruling classes, but also from the point of view of workers' protests and left protests to try and win our rights during this time. So I'd just like to welcome everybody, and we're going to, the order we'll go in is we'll have Elizabeth Latham speaking first, followed by Mary Merkinich, followed by Dick Nichols. Now, the way we'll handle the meeting is that we will hear from the 3 speakers first, who'll each speak for about 15 minutes each. Then that will be the end of the Facebook live stream, but people who are on the Zoom connection will be able to ask questions, but also engage in some discussion, online discussion. Now, I'll explain that process of how we'll handle that discussion online once the speakers are finished. But first, I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker, Lisbeth Latham. And just to let people know that the host of the meeting will sort of mute people, so people won't be able to speak until after the speakers have spoken and you ask, able to ask questions and so forth, or make comments. So now we'd like to just start the public meeting itself with our guest speakers. Firstly, Lisbeth Latham, education activist who's a regular writer, both in his personal blog, as well as Green Left Weekly and the Irish Broad Left publication. Thanks. Over to you, Lisbeth.
Well, thanks, Sue. Yeah, so if people want to refer to me, you can use my preferred pronoun, which is she or her. It's good to be here, comrades. It's a really troubling time, but someone is speaking. I'll keep on going. Because Zoom can be a bit glitchy, particularly because there's so many people using it at the moment for doing meetings. I'm going to be reading my talk from Word, but I've got the Zoom chat up. So if I drop out, could someone please just message me saying, hey, you've dropped out, and I'll just wait till it kicks back in. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm speaking from, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, paying respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this land was stolen and sovereignty was never ceded. So this talk is really going to be an expansion on and build on the articles that I've been writing for Green Left and for my blog over the last couple of weeks, and really trying to talk about the intertwining crises that we're meeting, which is both the health crisis that's been caused by the pandemic, and then the associated economic crisis, which has been triggered by the pandemic, but is really just exacerbating the crisis tendencies of capitalism that have been at play for some time, and like people have been waiting for the next financial crisis to hit, and it's just the perfect storm in some ways, and we can maybe talk about that in discussions. And I think we need to start by saying that this pandemic would have been difficult to contain for any economic system, but because the health crisis of this and this type of health crisis would have triggered some level of economic disruption, but that things have been made much worse by both the capitalist system's drive to constantly expand profits at the expense of the well-being of humans and the planet, and by the policy dictates of neoliberalism, which have sought to drive down social spending on public health, and at the same time increase the extent to which that healthcare is commodified. And that's highlighted by the US, which has got the highest per capita spending on healthcare, but also, quite frankly, has a terrible healthcare system, which fails to meet the basic needs of the vast bulk of that society, and where getting sick can be a financial disaster from which people can never escape. However, the US is not alone. As Emma Clancy points out in her excellent recent article on the European Commission health policy, which is available on her blog, Emma Clancy, the European Commission has been attempting to drive down the level and quality of public health care in the European Union for the past few decades, which has been a significant contributor to the ability of the individual healthcare systems of the European Union nations to respond to the crisis, most notably in Italy and the Spanish state, which we're going to hear about later on from Dick and possibly someone from Italy. I want to talk about my thinking in this period on how we respond to in the interests of working people, and how we use this opportunity to not just make people's lives better within the context of the crisis, but how do we move forward to challenge the system that is in crisis and build a better world. So some of the things I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about health policy. I'm not a medical expert, and beyond some general ideas around the need to limit the spread of the infection to save lives and improve the capacity of our health system to save lives, I don't know enough about epidemiology or virology to comment on that stuff. And I'm also not going to talk about the legal measures that the state's taking. I think that we're in a very difficult situation, and I don't know enough about the law other than to say that the state will take some chance, take the opportunity to try and expand their power in ways in which we are unhelpful, but at the same time, and we need to oppose, but at the same time, there will probably be some steps that are necessary at the same time. So I think that we can't prejudge any proposal, and we need to face everything on their merits, and we need to follow. To paraphrase Trotsky, that we can't just say that because the capitalists are doing something, it must be bad. We have to look at what they're doing and why they're doing it, and then make a judgment about what we think is the appropriate course of action in the given moment. So, what do I want to talk about? What I wanted to do is draw on my experience around industrial questions and around economic responses, largely informed both by my experience as a unionist and as an industrial and economic sociologist. If you've been reading my articles in Green Latham and on my blog, you'll have seen an evolution in the issues that I've been raising and how the demands I've suggested had modified as the crisis has unfolded. And I'm not seeking to develop a unified systematic response, but to taking, this will sound arrogant, it's not supposed to be arrogant, but drawing on what Gramsci said about his writing during the Red years in Italy in 1919 and 1920, just dealing with the immediate challenges of the day. So what do I see these as being? Well, in the beginning, I think that the challenge we were needing to address was around people needing to self-isolate if they were potentially ill, if they were infected. The problem that emerged from that is that while people should have been self-isolating, that our system was not and is not set up to support the majority of people from being able to actually do that. In Australia, there's 3.3 million people who are employed casually. They have no leave, and so what is going on there? And so them self-isolating would mean them just not being paid for weeks at a time, and that's something that is unfair to be asked of. And so the immediate initial responses was from the ACT and unions was the call for special leave, to cover that, particularly for a two-week period. I'll talk a bit about what I think about some of these demands. Subsequently, the government has, the Morrison government has put forward a range of stimulus packages focused on giving cash to small and medium employers, although that's involved in the last couple of days, which I thought I was going to have to completely rewrite this talk. Because I thought they were going to have an amazing, I was really hopeful they were going to have an amazing package, but it's pretty shit. And I'll go into some detail about what's wrong with the package that they've put forward. We've seen some expansion of welfare payments, and this is an important step, but again, I'll go into some of the problems about what's wrong with that in terms of the fact that it's not extended enough, it's been backdated too far in terms of when it will kick in. And it's not permanent, which is what we need to do. We need to have the increases, like the increases that they're talking about in terms of the job seeker allowance and for students, really a reflection of the inadequacy of Australia's welfare system. And we've subsequently had calls for wage subsidies via the tax system, both by unions and employer groups, which the government made announcements about over the last couple of days. And there's been a range of other announcement and calls, which I'll touch on at the end in terms of what I think is good and bad about those proposals. My concern from the get-go has been that the real danger was not the imminent health threat, as terrifying as that is, and it's super terrifying, particularly when you look at what's happening in Italy and Spain at the moment, but also other parts of Europe, and what's going to happen in the US, because the US is going to be a nightmare. But the consequence of the significant shutdown of the economy on working people, and I'm using the term working people to talk about both people in direct employment relationships and people whose relationship to production may be more accurately described as petty bourgeois. The first challenge is that we need to urgently stop the spread of the virus, which means as much as possible closing down the bulk of the economy. Except for those parts of the economy we need functioning to keep people alive, or to allow people to keep the essential workers to keep functioning. So healthcare, food production, power supply, manufacturing of personal protection equipment and other medical goods, medical research, distribution networks, childcare education for those still at work, which should only be the essential workers, public transport for people moving people around to work, and that is that everything else is pretty much not needed. If they can function at some level online, but that's fine. But if not, just close it down. That's my personal view, and that's been part of the struggle in Italy in the last week, where there's been a general strike by workers in a lot of manufacturing areas who have been required to attend work with very limited protection around maintaining their health. And there was essentially stay home in the last week by tens of thousands of Italian workers. The second challenge is, in my view, is ensuring that people are able to survive. This means special leave, initially to cover isolation and quarantine, recovery from illness. But however, I think that the call for 2 weeks leave for all workers, which the ACT put forward, was good. It was also insufficient and should have been, and this call should have been around, at that point, around unlimited leave to meet people's commitments, particularly as the economy slows down. And whilst I think that initially this needs to be done through companies' cash reserves, even the largest companies will run out of money if they're not trading. And so the demand for wage subsidies, which the ACTU started raising in the last week or so, and was supported unevenly by business, is really important. It's really important to guard against job losses and to try and maintain people's purchasing power as much as possible, along as well as the increases in welfare payments, which I've already mentioned, which need to also be made permanent. However, companies, particularly large companies at risk of failing, should simply be nationalised. So, and we should be looking at this as an opportunity to try and position the economy around the need for just energy transition post the current slowdown and the pandemic. So over the past 2 days, the government has announced a wage subsidy scheme, and that was just days after they rejected the call. The initial reports, particularly in the financial review, suggested that it was going to be similar to the schemes in Britain and Denmark, where they guaranteed a percentage of workers' wages. So the British scheme, I think, was 80% of workers' wages, and the Danish scheme was 75%. However, the Morrison government scheme does not do that. Instead, it sets some quite high qualifying barriers for businesses. So it means that for companies that have a revenue of less than $1 billion a year, they have to have lost 30% of their revenue. And for businesses that have a revenue of above $1 billion a year, they have to have lost 50% of their revenue. And there's a lot of those businesses. There's a lot of businesses that just won't qualify, but they're going to struggle, or they won't qualify for a while. And they'll struggle. And the payments will only start on May 1. They'll be backdated to March 1, but I'm not sure what people are supposed to do for 2 months if they've been stood down without pay. And the payments will be at 70% of the median wage, which is about $1,500 for all workers. And that's irrespective of their normal hours, what their normal wages are. And the money will go directly to companies. It's unclear how the payment will work. The Centre for Future Work suggests that workers will receive at maximum their normal wages, which means that some companies will be in a position to pocket the additional payment. It also needs to be acknowledged that for casual staff to qualify, they have to have been working for more than 12 months for the employer, and it's unclear how that's defined. It's unclear how breaks of service will work. For those that don't know what a break of service means, it means there's been a gap in the employment, which is very common for casual workers. And so without that being clear, it's very hard to know exactly how some of this stuff will work, and everyone who's looking at it is trying and get their heads around it. And that's been the problem with a lot of the government announcements, is that they're very light on detail, and there's a lot of grey to be filled in. And as you fill in the grey, you find out that what looked like a pretty shit deal is even shitter. So I need to say that while the announcement is a positive and significant step, like the earlier announcements by the government, it is delayed. It's been delayed too much, and it's insufficient. Payment needs to be brought forward, and equally important, it should be capture a greater share of workers' actual wages. And this fight will need to occur both at the level of lobbying government, but also in ensuring that all the subsidy money that is given to businesses flows through to working people and is not used to bolster the company's cash reserves. And whilst it may seem unrealistic to demand more, the rate at which the government is announcing new stimulus packages, generally after the previous packages proved itself inadequate in just days, shows both the pressure the government and the ruling class are under, and the extent to which they don't have answers to the problem facing the planet. which suggests we could rapidly enter a serious period of legitimation crisis. I'm not going to explain what that means. We can talk about it in discussion. It essentially means that the loss of people's confidence in the ruling class to rule, and their own loss of confidence in their ability to rule. Which means that it's vital that we have a vision of what could be done to meet the challenges facing working people, and be raising those demands and be trying to spread those demands. So having said that, I just want to talk about two things that have emerged in the last few weeks. The first is the idea from the government around the idea that workers should draw down their super as a way in which to meet gaps in their income. And we have to say that that proposal is a recognition by the government that their response is entirely inadequate. And it's aimed at shifting the cost of the crisis directly onto working people, forcing them to mortgage their futures to survive in the here and now. And that many of the most insecure workers won't have the money to draw down on. So for those that don't know, the proposal is that you'd be able to draw down $10,000 in this financial year and $10,000 next financial year. Lots of workers under 30 don't have that much money in their super accounts. And even in the late 40s, the average super account is about $60,000. So we're talking about a very large proportion of people's retirement savings that they would just be, they would never be able to recoup. So there's a real danger of that proposal destroying all or substantial parts of the retirement savings of working people, and creating a space for speculators to profit even more as funds are forced to sell off assets in order to pay demands from members for cash. It needs to be remembered that industry superannuation funds are major investors in many public-private partnerships, which is a problem of itself. Public-private partnerships are a really terrible way for governments to pay for infrastructure, like super bad ways. But it means that process will mean that companies that the super funds will be forced to sell off assets, and it may work as a mechanism to further and intensify the much more effective privatisation of those projects. And when I was discussing this talk with a comrade, they said, I think that the thing that many on the left miss about superannuation is that it is property in trust, and so basically it's inviolable from a capitalist perspective. It's not a pension that can be rated by government or company. But the drawdown and subsequent potential for liquidity crisis would change that situation significantly, because they would be able to raid those assets which are held in trust for working people's future. So we need to reject the idea of drawdowns and super, but it's not a question about what individuals should do. Like, if a person's desperate to survive, they're going to draw on their super, and there's nothing wrong with that. Because if you're struggling to survive and you can draw on your super, what else are you going to do? So we have to centre the demand for income maintenance, as well as the permanent increase in the age pension to a level of a livable wage coming out of this crisis. The final thing I want to touch on, which has sort of shifted a little bit in the last few days, which I have talked about on my blog, and there probably may be an article coming out in Green Left in coming issues, is around the call for rent strikes. There has been a growing call for people to not pay their rent. For many people, as they lose their jobs or are still down, there will be a real question regarding their ability to pay rent. And they're going to face a Sophie's choice of between paying rent or eating. And they may not even have that choice. They may not be able to do either. And in this context, the call to not pay rent or suspend rent mortgage payments makes total sense. Obviously, the government's announced that they're doing a moratorium on evictions for 6 months, and there's been agreements from the banks around mortgages. However, the problem is that if there's a generalised effort to not pay rent by people who can pay rent, we risk a deepening of the crisis. And so my view is that if people can afford to pay their rent, they should, or they should pay a bit of it. From my point of view, the primary problem that we face at the moment is around protecting people's incomes, the incomes of working people. And so if we are able to do that, all the other things that people are raising become secondary issues. Like, if you've got your income flowing through and it's guaranteed, you can pay your rent. If you don't need to go to work and you're getting paid, you don't need to worry about childcare, because you don't need to go to work and you can stay home and you can look after your children. And then teachers don't need to be at school and childcare workers don't need to be at childcare establishments, except for providing teaching and childcare for the workers in essential industries. I think that the events of the last month, the rapid shift in the position of the coalition government, along with the announcements of wage subsidies globally, shows the ruling class is unsure how to respond and are extremely susceptible to pressure. And we need to be taking this opportunity to raise demands that not only address the immediate challenges facing us, but which challenge the right of capital to dominate our society. This is an unprecedented challenge for society, but it is also an incredible opportunity to build social solidarity, community power, and fundamentally challenge the logic of not only neoliberalism, but capitalism itself. There will be a need to restart many industries post the pandemic, and that offers a serious opportunity for discussion as to what that reopening and retooling should look like. The crisis has highlighted a broad range of issues that around which there's a real need for to have a discussion around, such as the expansion of public health systems and for public humbling. Both of these would be huge opportunities for both jobs and the transformation of our economy from something that is a source of private wealth to a social good. Certainly, there's a real opportunity for construction of renewable energy as a mechanism for rebuilding the manufacturing sector in public hands. In all of this, we should be arguing for the right of working people to have a say, both in our communities, but also in our places of work, and the vital role. And this has been highlighted by the vital role that working people are playing in keeping the world functioning at the moment through this crisis and the total inadequacy of the market to respond effectively. Okay, I just got my 15-minute signal, so I've got one paragraph left to say. So to do this, we need to be creative, we need to be bold, and we need to build alliances based on the dynamics of the movement today, not historical divisions. Another world is possible, so let's build. Let's work together to build it. Be realistic, demand the impossible. Thanks a lot.
Thanks heaps, Elizabeth. I hope you didn't have to rush through the last bit too much. Our second speaker, now people who joined while Elizabeth was speaking will be able to ask questions after we've had all of our speakers. So don't worry, write down your questions and you know, just keep a note of them. You'll be able to ask them later. So our second speaker is Mary Merkenich, who is an education union activist, and she has been campaigning in Melbourne for the schools to be closed. So I'll hand it over to Mary, who's on the State Council of the Australian Education Union in Victoria. Mary, thanks.
Thank you, Sue, and hello to everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people on whose land we work, live and organise. We know their sovereignty was never ceded, and we should assist them in their struggles in any way we can, for example, by donating to Aboriginal or Indigenous groups, for example, SEED, which is an Indigenous Youth Climate Network. It wasn't so long ago, in fact, early January this year, that I was marching alongside an estimated 20,000 Victorians demanding serious action on the climate crisis. We were all angry and upset because Australia had just witnessed the devastation of the biggest and most terrible bushfires. And we know that it was caused by climate change and government inaction. This was an example of capitalism putting profits ahead of our planet. What we are witnessing at present is another example of capitalism's failure to address people's needs, because it's placing profits ahead of our well-being, our health, even our lives. COVID-19 has highlighted the results of an underfunded public health system. Our health system often struggles to meet normal demands for healthcare, but now it is struggling to cope with a relatively new and unknown pandemic. For example, Horsham, many of you will know Horsham, a regional city in Western Victoria and a very popular tourist destination. It currently has a 6-week waiting period to see a doctor. It is running out of testing equipment fast, and consequently there is talk of closing down the town. Federal and state governments have pledged to roll out more intensive care beds and community clinics. They have also promised to supply protective equipment for those still working, including teachers like myself, but so far much of this has been slow to materialise. The federal government and many state governments have refused to close schools, childcare centres or TAFEs. The workers in these industries have been treated as if they are of little significance to our leaders and therefore expendable. We have not been asked what we think or how we want this threat in our workplaces to be dealt with. Sadly, our unions have been missing in action, and so workers are very angry and upset. It is clear to all that the economics are more important than people's lives. It is also clear that the neoliberal attacks on public services, on wages, working conditions and welfare have compounded the challenge of overcoming the coronavirus. Further, the COVID-19 crisis has also shown us that it is those workers whose jobs are most undervalued by the system that we most rely upon. Workers in healthcare, retail, childcare, education and cleaning, among others. They are the ones that are keeping us going, even under lockdown. These workforces also tend to be largely comprised of women and migrants, powerless workers or with less powers. The International Labour Organization predicts that 25 million people worldwide will lose their jobs as a result of the virus, although this is considered a considerable underestimation. Up to 1 billion children worldwide have been affected by school closures. Hundreds of millions of migrants and refugees have no access to health infrastructure. Prisoners in overcrowded jails the world over, the homeless, and those in war zones are sitting ducks for this virus. So we need to be really serious about this. As Dr. Norman Swan, the ABC's health reporter and doctor, has said, we should view this as a war and prepare accordingly. It requires swift and unprecedented action. Based on current projections, globally, COVID-19 is likely to cause the deaths of many millions of people. The final death toll will be largely determined by the effectiveness and timeliness of the responses made by governments working closely with health professionals. We need, as societies, to rally all of society's resources and make decisions that protect all of us, especially the most vulnerable and powerless. For example, we should immediately begin a campaign of free mass testing for the virus and systematic contact tracing. We should boost funding for the public health system and nationalise public hospitals. We should shut down all schools, childcare centres and TAFEs and provide free childcare for those who require it. Some schools will have to stay open with skeleton teams who have volunteered and are adequately protected. No worker in any industry should be compelled to stay in a workplace. In fact, we need a complete lockdown of all non-essential industries. Essential industries being health and emergency services, power, food, and transport for these particular industries until a vaccination is available. We also need guaranteed paid sick leave and a minimum income for all workers to facilitate self-isolation. The key to being able to self-isolate is to have the economic means to do so when you're not getting paid work. Therefore, we also need a moratorium on rent and mortgage payments and access to welfare, Medicare, free public health and public services to everyone living in Australia. So that means we have to include asylum seekers, migrant workers on temporary visas, international students, New Zealand citizens, and tourists. And in addition, factories like Ford need to be retooled to make necessary medical supplies. The public sector should organise the distribution of food and necessities by paid, and this is really important, protected workers. Any business found to be price gouging should be subject to immediate nationalisation. Detention and remand centres should be closed, and prisons either be made safe or also closed. And that's what we as socialists would do, and also what we demand. Governments around the world have been centralising the response to the pandemic, and they have been declaring national emergencies. Such centralised coordination may now be urgent to confront this health crisis that we all face. But centralisation of emergency powers in capitalist states is something we all need to be very wary of. The powers they are giving themselves may well be used after the virus has been brought under control to suppress discontent, heighten surveillance, and maybe impose repressive social control, to push forward the global police state. Military and police forces are being used in countries around the world. In the United States, the National Guard has been deployed in at least 27 states, and the US Department of Justice secretly asked Congress to suspend constitutional rights. The far right will also use this crisis to further their aims, to stoke racism, divisions between workers, and support for authoritarian measures. So we, left and progressives, we need to build a broad alliance to stop anything like this being successful. Consciousness, on the other hand, to be really positive, consciousness seems to be growing worldwide on the need for grassroots solidarity and mutual aid in the face of this pandemic. There are many inspiring examples of such solidarity and also progressive work. I'll name a few. People in Canada started a huge petition to stop Justin Trudeau from handing over billions to big oil. They called instead for direct relief to workers, investments in social services, and an ambitious plan for a just transition to green jobs to help people recover from the COVID-19 crisis. And people also participated in a virtual art build to show solidarity with Indigenous climate defenders in Canada. Activists in the Philippines are meeting to work out their demands for a strong Green New Deal. On the Pacific island of Tokolo over the weekend, prepared food rations to assist people so that they could stay home took place. It's part of the local Inatu system, a form of sharing in a time of need. And all over, mutual aid community groups are springing up at lightning speed online to help with childcare, delivering medicines and financial support. For instance, a new COVID support network platform matches people seeking help with those nearby who are offering help. Left and progressive forces have to demonstrate alternatives to the inaction of the capitalist politicians and also to the far right, so that we can deal with this crisis on our terms and in our interests. And we have to be ready to deal with any coming upheavals so that the working class is empowered and can further our own interests. I would say that this is the construction of a society with values based on human needs rather than profit, and the needs of the environment and all the species that inhabit our planet. I'm going to stop there, but I'm happy to discuss any questions that people have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mary. You went under time. You still had a few more minutes up your sleeve. So now we'll move on to the other side of the world, and I'd like to welcome Dick Nichols, who's living in the heart of Spain in Barcelona. And of course, we've all seen the incredible scenes on our TV screens about the level of crisis in Spain. So I'd really like to welcome Dick to speak and describe what things have been like in Spain. Thanks, Dick. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Sue, and thanks for the opportunity to participate and give some of the stories that are happening, what's happening over here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Nick,
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Right. But before I go to Spain, I just want to quote from a letter from doctors in Bergamo in northern Italy, a letter they sent to the Massachusetts Medical Society, which just gives us an idea of what how bad the situation can become. These doctors write, "Our own hospital is highly contaminated and we are far beyond the tipping point. 300 beds out of 900 are occupied by COVID-19 patients. Fully 70% of ICU beds in our hospital are reserved for critically ill COVID-19 patients with a reasonable chance to survive. The situation here is dismal as critically ill COVID-19 patients force us to operate well below our normal standard of care. Waiting times for an intensive care bed are hours long. Older patients are not being resuscitated and die alone without appropriate palliative care, while the family is notified over the phone, often by well-intentioned, exhausted and emotionally depleted staff with no prior contact with them. But the situation in the surrounding area is even worse. Most hospitals are overcrowded, nearing collapse with medications, medical ventilators, oxygen and personal protective equipment are not available. Patients lie on floor mattresses. The healthcare system struggles to deliver regular services, even pregnancy care and child delivery, while cemeteries are overwhelmed, which will create another public health problem. In hospitals, healthcare workers and ancillary staff are alone trying to keep the system operational. Outside the hospitals, communities are neglected, vaccination programs are on standby, and the situation in prisons is becoming explosive with no social distancing. We have been in quarantine since March 10. Unfortunately, the outside world seems unaware that in Bergamo, this outbreak is out of control. Well, I just wanted to read that because it gives a sort of benchmark of how bad the situation can become. Here in Spain, or in the Spanish state, excuse me, we've not reached this point yet. But if radical and absolutely draconian measures aren't taken, then we could easily arrive at that point. At the moment, in the 17 Spanish, what are called states in Australia, what would be states in Australia called autonomous communities here, 8 out of 17 have exhausted their ICU units. So there's a dreadful, intense war to get new ICU units set up in sort of field hospitals. And Madrid and the Catalonia are the worst hit in this situation. There's a generalized shortage of equipment, especially of respirators, and the level of stress on professionals, especially I would say the younger generation who've never gone through anything remotely like this, is extremely hard and extremely high, and the infection rate amongst professionals is very high. For example, there's over 1,000 doctors, nurses and other health workers who are infected in Catalonia alone. But this situation we can still stop this, with appropriate measures, we can still stop this becoming as bad as the situation in Italy. I want to describe just how health workers are tackling the crisis here. and just stress some of the points that Mary and Elizabeth already made, which is this thing is going to be defeated by the coordinated effort and sacrifice of ordinary people, of ordinary workers, by which I mean, you know, from the health professionals down to people who were never noticed in normal life, like the people who are cleaning the streets. In the Spanish state, unfortunately, the problem has been exacerbated by the decision of the Spanish government about how to handle the crisis. This goes to the centralisation decision that's already been mentioned. What they decided was that instead of letting the existing health system, which overwhelmingly operates through the autonomous communities, through the states in Australian terms, instead of letting them continue and the central government acting as a coordinating and facilitating body, they decided to centralise everything and take all the major decisions at the central Spanish level. What this meant is that the federal equivalent would be equivalent to the Federal Department of Health here is making decisions, or is having to make decisions on things like procurement, for which it doesn't have the competence or the people. So you have over-centralised sort of a bureaucratic chaos at the centre, and that inevitably has led to it's a situation where hospitals, health regions just try and survive as they can. So you get centralised bureaucracy, and then at the local level, people just trying to set up field hospitals, get equipment, get masks, get respirators, and make the system survive however they can do that. We have a very strange situation here in Catalonia, because you've got the national question, which I'll talk about in a minute, and of course politics doesn't stop just because you've got a life and death situation. Here in Barcelona, there's a push, and it's successful. They've expanded the number of ICU units from 3 times in the space of 10 days here. But it's a push to just set up field hospitals in, you know, sports centres, gymnasiums, and places like that. And where does the equipment come from? Well, you get to a situation where local mayors are ringing up bed manufacturers, or going down to IKEA, which is closed, and saying, "How many beds have you got here? I want to buy 200 beds." We have the very bad situation where respirators, there's a big shortage of respirators here. The response, however, has been that local industry, and this is even, you know, big industry, which is closed down, has said, we'll churn out respirators for you. So, you know, one of these holies of capitalist production, which is patent law, goes out the window. And I just want to say a few things about, you know, what openings this gives to socialist policy later on in this presentation. But patent law is the first thing, because what's happened is, of course, that we just grab whatever piece of equipment we can, out of which we can make a respirator, and this gets done. In Barcelona, there's a consortium which is already churning out 300 of these improvised respirators a week. They've been certified as functional and working, and not going to place anybody's lives in risk inadvertently by the Spanish Ministry of Health. And similar things are happening in other parts of the Spanish state. Now, my third area, which I want to talk about, and I just want to mention, this is in much more detail in the interview I did in Links with Fred Fuentes. But the third area I want to talk about is the policies needed to defeat this virus. In the Spanish state, we're already gone through what you're going through in Australia, which is the great debate about, well, how total does the shutdown have to be? And effectively what happened, if we will get into the Italian scenario that I described at the beginning, if we get into that scenario, it will be because we're 2 weeks behind the curve here. And the reason we're 2 weeks behind the curve, because the central government was under a great pressure from industry not to close down everything. And of course, here we come into politics in the Spanish state. From the beginning, the Catalan government, which is supposedly to be a right-wing nationalist government, was telling the progressive government in Madrid, which is the Socialist Workers' Party plus United Unidas Podemos government, that they had to implement a complete shutdown and that they would be given, that their medical experts were telling them, that their consultative committees of epidemiologists were telling them, the sooner you have a complete shutdown of everything but emergency services and absolutely essential production, the sooner you do that, the more lives you will save. And that was an argument. And of course, because this is being proposed by the Catalan government, it therefore became unacceptable. Ipso facto, oh, well, they're proposing it, therefore we can't do it. And when the Balearic Islands government, which is a PSOE government, proposed essentially the same thing, and the Balearic Islands have been effectively sealed off from the rest of the Spanish state, that was accepted. And we're already seeing that that has been a successful, more successful in the Balearic Islands. The rate of contamination and the rate of spread of the virus is discernibly less in the Balearic Islands than it is here, and certainly in Madrid, where it is closest to being into sort of Italian situation. One of the issues that is needed to defeat the virus and is massive testing, which goes beyond the bounds of the existing health system. That is to say, today, a study by the Imperial College in London brought out a study, their update on the COVID virus, which said that up to 15 times as many people probably in Spain and in other European countries were actually infected by the virus, probably. We could project that, but we don't know because there's not been massive testing. One of the reasons that Singapore, Vietnam, Taiwan, other Asian countries have had a better policy and have much more success in containing the virus is, of course, that they learned from the SARS and MERS epidemics, and on the basis of that pretty horrifying experience, they introduced community testing on a broad basis. Any sign of a symptom, people have to take a test. Isolation takes place straight away, and this way you can keep the so-called, the curve flatter. But when you have a community, a public health system which is based on patient care, but not on public health, and community-based public health, then of course it's hard, and now it's got to be done, to improvise a community-based public health system. And the harder and the more privatized your health system is, of course, and we'll see this in the United States, the even harder it is to do that, because you're infringing on the right not to have public health. You're infringing on the right not to have big government interfering in your lives. So that's a point that is stressed by the doctors in Bergamo, this article is worth reading. I sent it to Australia. I don't know exactly who I sent it to, can't remember that. But the article is worth reading because it's basically saying, in this face of this sort of crisis, you need, they don't say this, but this is what they're referring to, you need Cuban-style public health. We don't want to discuss, the adequacies and inadequacies of the Cuban health system, but one thing is certain, that it is a public health system based on prevention, community health standards, and strict control against any sort of epidemic. My fourth point is on the effect of all of this on Spanish state politics. As I said earlier, just because this is a question of life and death doesn't mean that the political fight stops. At the all Spanish level of the right wing, has said, oh, well, this is a national emergency, it's a war, it's all, everybody together, solidarity between all political forces. But at the same time, of course, they saying, when this is all over, we'll be telling you, what you did wrong. The Spanish right finds it a bit difficult to manoeuvre in this situation because the way this centralisation has been done in Spain is in a very Spanish way, with the army being brought in, with the police force being given a big role, and with the whole thing being presented as Spain will defeat the virus. So it's, it's not human beings fighting the virus, it's Spain is fighting the virus, which of course then produces an allergic reaction in the nationalities in Catalonia and Euskadi in the Basque country and in Galicia to a lesser extent. But for example, we have army units, decontamination army units in Catalonia at the moment. The immediate response at the beginning was these people were sent in without being asked for, but just to prove the point, who's in charge now? We're in charge now. We're now overriding and establishing our presence. Now, given the intensity of the crisis, of course, the Catalan government and local councils are now using these army units and requesting their support, their decontamination units. But of course, this could have been done in a completely uncentralised way. Not a completely uncentralised way, but it could have been done if the PSOE government is serious about its rhetoric about Spain being a nation of nations, and we will look to collaborate, and the central government looks to be a facilitator and a coordinator, then they could have done this centralisation in a very different way. The other thing I'd like to stress is what's already been mentioned by Mary, is that the far right is mobilising to use this crisis. So this will be, and we've already got it yesterday in Hungary. What happened in the Hungarian parliament yesterday was that the ruling government, the ruling party, passed a sort of enabling law, a Hitler-style 1933 enabling law, which effectively suspends all rights, suspends the constitution, suspends elections, and gives the government the right to do what it likes. And this was voted through. And we will see a lot more of attempts to use this crisis by the far right. The other use of the crisis here is scapegoating. In Spain, of course, scapegoating from the right is just part of the daily, it's just in the atmosphere. It's, what you have for breakfast. Who are they scapegoating today? Well, one theme they're running on is that the big propagator of this virus was IWD, International Women's Day. It's because they let those feminists or feminazis out on the streets on International Women's Day. This was a big propagator of the virus. So we can expect to hear a lot more about that when the crisis, or if and when the crisis is finally overcome. Finally, I just wanted to make some points about the political ramifications of the crisis and what openings it gives us for socialist solutions, because as comrades have already said, it is a situation of dramatic crisis of governance, of ordinary capitalist governments, where they suddenly have to drop a whole lot of their holies of holies. Suddenly these holies of holies with which, the working class and all the massive ordinary people are instilled, that things that have to be done, deficits have to be brought under control. I mean, I think in Australia, that's been an absolute obsession. I can't be sure of that. But suddenly, of course, deficit reduction targets have gone out the window. The patent law, as I've already mentioned, has gone out the window. At the European level, the Growth and Stability Pact, which is like the 11th commandment here, which is the requirement of all member states of the European Union to meet deficit reduction targets, that's been dropped. No sackings there's a whole debate about, you have a law for laying people off unavoidably, and that's what's being applied. and that will give people, workers laid off will get, I think it's 75, don't quote me on this, 75% or 80% of their usual wage. But of course, the bosses are already and pleading force majeure, saying, well, we can't just lay people off, we've got to sack them. And the government came out, the UP Minister for Labor said, no, we're not going to have any sackings, and said there wouldn't be any sackings. And this was actually a bit of bullshit, because all they did was they applied the law that if there's no agreement over sackings, then, that is to say, if the unions are strong, essentially, that's what it means. If the unions have some presence in the workplace, then the boss has to pay more, has to pay 33 days wages for every year of service instead of 20 days wages for every year of service. But this brings up the whole question of what has to be done, and Elizabeth has already talked about this, but there's some good examples. I think the best example is the Danish example to date, which is essentially the Danish government has said, we'll just put everything on freeze, don't worry, stay at home, and we will pick up the tab. We won't pick up the whole tab, it'll be 75% or 80% of the wage, I don't know the full details. But essentially this means, and the Catalan government has taken this up here as the next move that has to be adopted in Spain, which is if you have a guaranteed minimum income, then this is a simple thing that can be understood. It helps the self-employed, it helps small business, and then that way people's anguish about what's going to happen to them, and especially people in the less organised areas, you know, the self-employed, small traders, that's a very big sector here in Spain, you know, 3 million, 4 million people, then that anguish is stopped. And so even the Spanish former treasurer, who's now a deputy governor of the European Central Bank, a person called de Guindos, has said we should introduce a guaranteed minimum income for everybody for the duration of the crisis. Well, why just for the duration of the crisis? That should be, you know, this is another example of a measure that they could be forced to take, because as has been pointed out already, the measures they take are the least they think they need to take, and then of course they have to go and do something else more. But this is an example of the sort of measure that should be campaigned for. What is the likely size of the crisis? Well, there's a lot of statistics going around, but the bank rescue package in Spain from the financial crisis was, this is the government forked out for the finance sector, 60 billion euros. And that will be small compared to the sort of figure that's needed here after this crisis. As I say, figures are thrown around of between a 5% and a 15% drop in production in gross domestic product. This crisis will also exacerbate North versus South tensions within the European Union. They were very strong at the time of the financial crisis and about, well, we're not going to bail out those Greeks are going to pay. And that is going to be small scale. Already the Dutch finance minister has come out. I don't know why it is always Dutch finance ministers who are the nastiest people in Europe, but anyway, the Dutch finance minister has come out and said, Spain and Italy didn't use the boom to cut back on their debt and their deficit, and now they want us to bail them out again. You know, well, that has produced a very violent reaction, even including France. I must say, Macron has come out against this stance, as has Portugal. But it just shows you the intense pressures that they're going to be operating in the European Union. The European Union got out of the previous financial crisis basically through the European Central Bank, just churning out money in very creative ways. But now we've got zero interest rates or negative interest rates. So monetary policy and churning out money is not going to be enough. There's going to have to be a big increase in public investment, which opens up the whole question of public investment for what? For a green transition is obviously what we would say, a serious green transition, not just the sort of fake transition that they're talking about here. One interesting thing that can come up in this situation, I think, is a point that we can make as socialists is people will say, but this is going to be a huge increase in the debt burden. Future generations are going to be lumbered with this. And one thing that was said during the Second World War is if you worried about the size of the deficit that's incurred by financing the war, then let's impose a special tax on the wealthy. That is to say, put a special wealth surcharge on savings over, say, you know, in the Australian case, $500,000. If you're worried about the deficit, you can even make it a temporary wealth surcharge and say, well, we'll pay it off in the future when we can. But it just is a way of dramatising the fact that, you know, those who can afford to pay for this crisis should be the ones who can kind of pay for it. And let me just finish on this point. I think if this obviously demonstrates, this crisis demonstrates and makes it possible for us to campaign, for socialists to campaign, and it will be very easy to campaign here, for strengthening of public community-centred healthcare where this is already the basic framework of health delivery, which is the case in the Spanish state. And I must say, from an Australian point of view, being an Australian in Spain, the community health system here is like, you know, paradise from our point of view, from the Australian point of view, compared to what you have what we have in Australia, even of course more so than in the United States. But of course, there's a lot of underfunding. There's creeping privatisation. There's the private sort of nibbling at trying to take bits of it out of the public system. That will all end. But this crisis, of course, makes it possible for us to sketch out and use the need for community-based healthcare to say this is how health should be delivered. Public health is actually a tautology. Public health is public. And therefore, if you've got private providers, they've got to be totally under control of the public system. And the perspective should be to gradually, or at some speed or other, weed out private provision and make public health totally public and funded from the tax system and based in the community. So I'll just leave it there, and I'm happy to take, of course, any questions about what's going on. That's it.
Well, thanks heaps, Dick and Mary and Lisbeth. Now the YouTube live stream will end now. So thanks anyone who joined us for the YouTube live stream.